Power speech wygłosi pan profesor Andreasa Nölke, Uniwersytet Goethego we Frankfurcie. To profesor nauk politycznych, w szczególności stosunków międzynarodowych i międzynarodowej ekonomii politycznej na Uniwersytecie Goethego we Frankfurcie z doświadczeniem w niemieckiej Agencji Współpracy Technicznej oraz w Komisji Europejskiej i Banku Światowym. Zapraszam pana profesora bardzo serdecznie. How the corona pandemic has amplified the turn away from globalization and towards a more active role of the state in many fields of the economy.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I'm very much looking forward to our discussions today. Let me briefly give you an overview about my talk. I will first inform you about the deglobalization process that had already started before the corona pandemic broke out. Then, during the corona pandemic, this process has been amplified and the role of the state has even become more prominent. And after the pandemic, the process did not reverse, but even further increased in relation to the war on Ukraine and the decoupling between China and the US. Now, to start with this process of deglobalization, many of us are familiar with the process of globalization of the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s. It was a process where we thought that globalization is something that cannot be stopped, that is always continuing. But if you look at some figures, and here I'm starting with the share of trade in relation to global GDP, you see that this process that has started to take off in the mid-90s until the global financial crisis is now stagnating and moving backwards a bit. And this is not by coincidence. If you look at trade measures, measures that are either promoting free trade or restricting free trade, you see since the global financial crisis an increasing number of measures, these are the red ones, that are restricting free trade, and a stagnation with regard to measures that are promoting free trade. So this kind of decrease of trade in relation to GDP is also based on protectionist measures that are increasing, that have been increasing over the last 10 years. The same and even more clearly applies to foreign direct investment, something that is also very important for the Polish economy. We have seen quite a strong growth of FDI, roughly until the global financial crisis globally, then a period of stagnation, and during the last years we see a decreasing volume of FDI flows if we compare this with the overall economy, again, if we compare this with global GDP. So we see this process of deglobalization. It's a soft deglobalization. We are still living and working in a global economy, but this process that we are familiar with in the 90s and 2000s is not with us anymore. It is decreasing. And again, turning to the political side, this is not by coincidence, where we have seen during the 80s, 90s, and until the global financial crisis, a huge amount of international investment agreements that were supposed to support foreign direct investment. We are seeing a decreasing number of new investment agreements, and we're seeing an increasing number of termination of these kind of agreements. So again, it's not only on the economic side, but there are also indications that on the political side, governments are moving away from openness towards foreign direct investment. So this is a process of deglobalization that has not been really noted by many people, that has started, let's say, in the second decade of the new millennium. The corona pandemic, my next topic, has made this process way more visible. And I will demonstrate this on the background of a book that I just published a couple of months ago that takes stock of what has been decided, what has happened politically in terms of economic policies during the pandemic. And basically, it's a kind of an overview, one-stop guide to what has happened during the pandemic, because the pandemic has affected nearly every field of our economy, of our society, of our political systems, and I found it very difficult to get an overview about all these manifold developments. So this book is a survey of 30 topics where the pandemic has affected our economy, our political systems, our society, and it reviews the studies of others, some 300 empirical studies that have been published in the first 2 years of the pandemic. Arguably, these were the crucial years of the pandemic, since this year it has decreased somewhat. The focus is on the one side on what is happening, which direction we're moving, but also on the policy alternatives, because very often a big economic crisis is a game changer. We have seen this with the global financial crisis. We have seen this with the global economic crisis of the 1920s. We have seen this with the global crisis, at least in the Western world, of the early 1970s. And it's very important, I think, from my perspective, that we do not believe in the so-called TINA thinking. TINA stands for there is no alternative, that there is now a certain direction we have to move into, and I think it's very important to be aware of the alternatives. But today I will focus on some common tendencies that we can see during the pandemic with regard to the role of the state. And let me continue with what I started before with deglobalization. You can see in the field of trade policy that during the pandemic protectionism has increased quite a bit. Normally protectionism is for the protection against imports. During the pandemic, very surprisingly, we have also seen export curbs. So countries interdicted the export of certain goods, for example, medical equipment, even within the European Union. This was interdicted. It was really terrible. For example, Germany did not allow the export of medical equipment to Italy, which was first hit by the pandemic. But many countries have left the places that they have implemented during the pandemic in place. So we are still on a high level of protectionism. And for example, the Biden government in the US did not only retain all the measures that Trump has implemented, but has further increased protectionist measures. So we are now living in a world with a high degree of protectionism. Next, the pandemic has also further changed our perspective towards foreign direct investment. Whereas before the pandemic, foreign direct investment was seen very positively, countries were competing for FDI. Now, at least certain forms of foreign direct investments are seen very critical, particularly foreign direct investment from China, and of course, particularly in the West. The reason behind this was that China recovered, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, much more quickly than many Western countries, and went on a shopping spree in, let's say, Europe, the US, trying to acquire companies that were in trouble during the pandemic. And many governments, European governments, the US government, but also countries like India, started more intense screening of FDI, becoming more restrictive. And this is a continuing discussion. If you, for example, the German government just yesterday, a 100-page report leaked about new needs for screening of inward FDI from China and going against Chinese acquisition of German companies and so on. Generally, of course, one of the fields where the pandemic, also in the eyes of the larger public, has made a big impression is on global production networks. I mean, this is before the pandemic, people in the field, specialists, always were familiar with the existence of very long, very fragile global production networks. But during the pandemic, even the layman was familiar how sensitive these production networks are, that many things that we are used to have as an input or as a product for consumption for our industry were not available anymore. And since then, nearly every government has started to try to set up policies with regard to the reshoring of production, to not rely anymore on this very fragile, very long global production networks, to reduce dependency on China. This started with medical goods during the pandemic, but of course this has moved on to all kinds of crucial technologies such as batteries, microchips, and so on more recently. Also, we have seen during the pandemic a very different stance in the field of competition policy with regard to state aid. I mean, those of you who are familiar with European Union economic policies know that the European Commission is extremely strict traditionally on state aid because it has a danger to affect competition between the member states of the European Union. And during the pandemic, it has become way more lenient towards state aid. It has allowed lots of measures that normally are completely interdicted, and arguably it is still way more lenient than it was before. But also with regard to more domestic economic policies, during the pandemic, we have seen a strongly increased role of the state throughout the world, at least according to my survey. So for example, in terms of fiscal policies, many governments that could afford it, I mean, many poorer governments in, let's say, in the global south couldn't afford it, but those governments that were able to afford it have put in support policies for companies on a big scales, because many companies were threatened with bankruptcy during the pandemic. And they didn't, after the pandemic, they didn't really go back to the previous state. So we are still having way more fiscal support for companies in many countries by state institutions. We are seeing a big return of industrial policies. I mean, Robert will tell us much more about this later today. The issue of technological sovereignty is now the issue of industrial policies. I mean, before, industrial policy was normally some kind of developmental policy in order to get your economy on a higher level of development. But now, of course, it's also about decreasing your dependency on other economies with regard to crucial technologies. In the same way, the state has moved massively, even more massively, in the field of innovation. I mean, we know from Mariana Mazzucato and others that the state always was very important for basic innovation, but now it has even furthered this. For example, in Germany, there was a company that was involved in very promising vaccine research, and the German state just bought a 30% stake, which was absolutely unforeseen so far, just to make sure that this company stays in Germany and will not be sold, for example, to the US. And generally, we have seen a substantial increase in state ownership during the pandemic. For example, the German state bought a share of Lufthansa during the pandemic. It has used states have used the public development banks. I mean, in Germany, the Kreditanstalt for Wiederaufbau was always a very important public development banks, but now many other European countries are making use of public development banks for industrial policy, and this continues also after let's say the summit of the pandemic. So this process that has started already before the pandemic has been massively amplified during the pandemic. The state is really back on the economic agenda, but even before, let's say, the pandemic was over and we could reflect on the pandemic, as you here in Poland certainly are most familiar with, we have certain geopolitical issues that further amplify this tendency to bring the state back in. And this is clearly very obvious with regard to sanctions. I mean, if governments or the European Union implement sanctions, this is of course a massive state intervention in the economy. Certain companies are not allowed to do certain exports anymore, certain imports anymore. So again, the state has become way more important. It also informally puts pressure on business, for example, to withdraw from Russia, or in these days, for example, in Germany, there's a lot of pressure on German business to withdraw from China. So again, companies cannot make their decisions based on, let's say, shareholder value, cost-benefit calculations, but they have to incorporate a lot of geopolitical considerations in making their decisions. We also see, and this is maybe a more long-term tendency, that of course those countries that are under sanctions and those countries that more or less are liaised with these countries realize how important certain global infrastructures are. For example, the cross-border payment infrastructure that most of you will know under the heading of SWIFT, which is only a small part of this infrastructure. It's only the information service involved. But of course, countries like Russia and China have realized that they have to reduce their reliability on these kind of infrastructures. They have built up, or they are building up, their alternative infrastructure. So in the future, we will have a way more fragmented international financial system, maybe one US-centered, one Chinese-centered, with very different institutions and standards. And then, of course, most recently, the state has intervened massively in the energy sector. You certainly are all familiar with that. I mean, the German bazooka is certainly well known in Poland as well. Of course, this is also a big danger of making distractions in the economy, favoring certain countries that can afford these interventions against those that cannot. So we see an amplification of this. And the big topic that will be the next topic after the Ukraine war, but of course has started already, is the issue of decoupling between China and the US. Both sides are serious with decoupling. I mean, China has started with this already a couple of years ago with a Made in China 2025 policy, but now the US are getting serious as well. And you see this now on let's say on a weekly basis. You see decisions in this regard. Just recently, you had the export curbs by the US governments on semiconductors. Then I think last week the US curb on Chinese telecoms equipment. Before it was only Huawei. Now it's all Chinese telecoms equipment that may not be used. You have the huge subsidies program of the US government for microchips. And of course, other countries, because the US is moving forward, have to follow. So, for example, Japan just has set up a national consortium called Rapidos, where all the major Japanese companies are coming together to build Japanese microchips. And in Germany, we had 3 cases during the last weeks where the German government intervened in the economy to avoid Chinese acquisitions of parts of German companies. The most well-known is a Hamburg harbor one, but there were also 2 in the field of semiconductors. So again, you see this tendency towards more state involvement, towards less economic liberalism that has started already slowly to build up steam during the 2010s is now really intensifying more recently. And to conclude my talk and to look forward to the discussion, what are the implications? I think, and of course now I'm moving from, let's say, existing knowledge to prediction, to speculation, but my impression is that we are moving into a period of capitalism that is less liberal. It is a new wave of organized capitalism. This is not new. We have seen this before. We had, for example, a rather liberal capitalism during the 1920s, and we had a more organized capitalism starting with a New Deal in the US and with post-war reconstruction. So we had this move from liberal to organized already before, and apparently now we're getting this kind of move again from liberal to organized. This, of course, on the one side, can be, let's say, from a citizen's perspective, quite exciting, because this allows governments, democratically elected governments, parliaments, a strong role in steering the economy. But of course, this is also something that has a lot of challenges. And it's now up for the next years for us, and of course, particularly for policymakers, to decide whether we have a positive role of the state, of leader of innovation, of protection, of stabilization of the economy, of support of domestic companies, or we get a period where we have, let's say, something like a complacency of the private sector that is being, doesn't have to compete that much anymore internationally, of rent-seeking, where you cultivate political linkages more than you focus on your production decisions, and of state capture, where you cultivate your your connections with the state instead of focusing on innovation and great new products and services. So these are exciting times. Exciting times are not always the best times, but at least for us, for discussion, hopefully this is useful. Thank you.